If you've ever been dismissed in a room full of people who had already decided what you were worth, stay with me, because by the end of this, the room looked very different. Drop your country in the comments and let's get into it. I sat in that Charlotte courtroom and watched Marin smirk. She had the kind of smirk that belongs on someone who has already counted the money and picked out the furniture. Her lawyer, Graham Pike, was mid-sentence, telling Judge Iris Langford that I was an adequate husband at best, a man who had never once matched the Caldwell family's financial standing, their social reach, or what Graham actually called, without blinking, their cultural polish. I kept my hands flat on the table and said nothing. Marin leaned toward the junior associate seated in the second chair beside her and whispered something. The young woman almost smiled. I caught just enough to know Marin was talking about hidden asset work, the kind of fraud tracing I used to do before the marriage quietly swallowed that part of my life. The implication was plain. Rich rooms were never really mine, and I should have known better than to think otherwise. Graham was still building his picture of me, a man who wrote his wife's name, leaned on her family's contacts, and contributed sentiment where she contributed substance, when Judge Langford opened the sealed disclosure packet I had filed 10 days earlier. The judge stopped talking. She turned a page. She turned another one. Then she looked up from the packet and over the top of her glasses, and the courtroom went so quiet I could hear paper shifting at the clerk's table. Marin finally looked up from her notepad. That pause, that single loaded pause, was the moment nearly 7 years of careful, patient work announced itself. But to understand what was inside that envelope, you have to go back to where all of it started. I met Marin Caldwell at a donor dinner for a children's literacy foundation in Uptown Charlotte. I was there because the foundation's CFO had hired me to trace roughly $400,000 that had migrated sideways through 3 vendor accounts, and I had just handed him the answer over appetizers. Marin was a junior associate at Harwick & Bowl, Trusts and Estates, and she introduced herself like a woman who was already thinking about her next promotion. She was sharp. She was funny in a dry, precise way that I respected. And she seemed genuinely interested in the fact that I had built my practice from nothing, working fraud cases that bigger firms didn't want to touch. That interest, I would later understand, was real and temporary. We got married 14 months later at a resort on Sea Island, Georgia. It was a beautiful wedding. It was also the last major decision in our marriage that didn't involve her mother, Vivian Caldwell, in some operational capacity. Vivian didn't just attend the wedding. She ran the seating chart, selected the caterer, and made a quiet remark to me in the receiving line about how grateful Marin was to have found someone so earnest. She said it warmly. She meant it as a limit I was not supposed to cross. After that, my practice went into storage. Marin and I agreed, or I agreed while she expressed certainty, that stability mattered more than the volatility of independent fraud work. I took a salaried compliance role at a regional investment firm. I wore the right suits. I attended the right lunches. At one of those lunches, a man named Fletcher Holt told the table that Marin had done wonders for my bloodline. Everyone laughed. I picked up my water glass and drank. When I brought up reopening my own practice 2 years in, Marin called the idea cute and moved on to talking about the lake house renovation. The compliance job paid well enough, but it was work designed for someone who had already decided to stop moving. I hadn't decided that. 18 months into the marriage, I opened an old brokerage account with $1,180, money I had kept separately since before the wedding, and registered a shortened version of my original business name as a limited liability company in my name alone. I told Marin it was a hobby project. She didn't ask again. My first real client came through a referral from a former colleague. Alma Reed owned a laundromat on Central Avenue and 3 rental properties in the Noda neighborhood, and her payroll processor had been skimming from her for 11 months. I found it in 4 days. The total came to just over $19,000, and Alma looked at the documentation with the expression of someone who had suspected something for a long time, but hadn't trusted herself to be right. She paid me $3,400, fed me sweet potato pie in her back office, and told me that rich people were terrified of men who took notes and waited. I wrote that down when I got to my car. Over the following months, and then over the next several years, I took on 6 more clients, small business owners, a nonprofit, a family trust in dispute, and reinvested almost everything I earned. I opened positions in municipal bonds and won early stake in a medical monitoring startup called Viridian Health, introduced to me by a founder named Maris Whitlock, after I untangled her cap table from a mess her original attorney had left behind. Maris sent 3 more founders my way within the year. I kept wearing the plain suits. I kept attending the lunches. Marin made a remark at a dinner party about how I dressed like a man who didn't own mirrors. Everyone at the table appreciated that. I let them. Marin's father, Douglas Caldwell, died in March of the 5th year. He was a measured, self-contained man who had always treated me with something close to neutral fairness, which in the Caldwell family ranked as warmth. His estate was substantial, and Marin had been quietly counting on a distribution to land within 6 months of the death. It didn't land. His primary trust was flagged under a private compliance review, the kind that moved slowly and left beneficiaries waiting with no clear timeline. Something shifted in Marin after that. She got colder in ways that were specific and purposeful. She started asking careful questions about my work schedule. She made references to our finances in front of other people, always framed as concern, always landing just short of accusation. And she began having dinner with Rowan Hatch, a development director at a nonprofit that orbited Vivian's donor circle, with a frequency she described as professional. I followed her one Thursday evening in October to a rooftop bar on South Tryon. I sat 2 tables back, ordered a club soda, and watched Rowan kiss her in the way men kiss women when they believe they've already won. I had my phone on the table, face down, recording audio. At one point, Marin laughed at something Rowan said, and then made a comment that I caught in full. She said that humble men were useful because they signed things without reading them carefully enough. She meant me. She was right that I had signed things. She was wrong about what I had read. What she didn't know was that I had already traced the side transfers, 3 of them, routed through a joint account I had monitored for 4 months. And she didn't know that Rowan's interest in her was partly, if not primarily, driven by what proximity to Vivian's donor network could do for his career trajectory. I finished my club soda and drove home. 3 weeks later, I drove up to Raleigh and sat across from Nadine Vale in a conference room with no windows. Nadine was a family law attorney with a reputation for being methodical enough to make opposing counsel uneasy. I handed her the recording, the transfer records, and a summary of my current asset position. She read everything without speaking. Then she set the transfer records down and asked me to walk her through the prenup. I walked her through it. She stopped me at page 9. The clause she found was one Marin had pushed for herself, back when she was still a trusts and estates associate, and thinking about how to protect future Caldwell trust distributions from any marital claim I might one day raise. The language was precise. Any venture developed without spousal capital contribution or active partnership involvement would be classified as a separate asset, fully exempt from division. Marin had written that clause with herself in mind. She had signed it without imagining it would ever need to run in my direction. Nadine set the document down on the table and allowed herself a small, contained smile. She said that Marin's favorite piece of defensive architecture had just become a bear trap, with Marin's own fingerprints on the release mechanism. We mapped out the timeline together. Nadine's position was that we should wait. She wanted Marin to feel safe enough to make representations under oath that the recording, the transfer records, and the disclosures would then directly contradict. Premature pressure would only sharpen Marin's preparation. Patience, Nadine said, was the only move worth making. I agreed. I had been patient for 5 years. A few more months cost me nothing. Marin filed in February. She moved quickly once she decided to move, retained Graham Pike inside a week, transferred several items of personal property to her mother's house, and within 3 weeks had installed Rowan Hatch at the lake house on a rotating weekday basis. She told people, through the careful social machinery that Vivian maintained, that I had buckled under provider pressure, that I had relied on her name for professional credibility, that I had borrowed against our future and left her carrying the weight. Vivian reinforced all of it. She spread the version of events that positioned me as a well-meaning but ultimately insufficient man who had overstretched in a marriage above his natural level. She said it at lunches. She said it at the kind of charity events where people listened without appearing to. Then Marin made a specific mistake. Through Vivian's property connections, she applied pressure to the commercial landlord who held the lease on Alma Reed's laundromat. The pressure was indirect. A word here, a mention there. But its purpose was to create enough friction in Alma's business life that Alma might become too distracted or too worried to engage with any ongoing legal proceedings. What Marin hadn't accounted for was that Alma Reed had been managing difficult people in business for 23 years, and had long ago developed the habit of saving every voicemail and every text message that felt even slightly off. Alma forwarded the full package to Nadine within 48 hours of receiving the first message. I heard about it that same evening. I was in the condo I already owned, the one I had purchased in my own name 2 years before the filing, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I had been patient with everything Marin did to me, but going after Alma, a woman who had done nothing but run her business and pay her bills, was a different category of action. It meant Marin had stopped playing defensively and started playing without concern for who she hit on the way through. I called Nadine, told her we were ready, and started preparing the disclosure packet. Graham Pike opened his argument in Judge Langford's courtroom with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the other side has nothing. He described me as an insecure man who had watched his wife outperform him at every level and had now constructed a litigation strategy based on leverage and grievance. He used the word insecure 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. Marin testified after the lunch recess. She was composed and specific. She said I had contributed minimally to our shared financial life. She said my professional work during the marriage had been modest and largely dependent on her family's network for whatever credibility it carried. She said the lifestyle we maintained, the lake house, the club memberships, the dinners, had been funded overwhelmingly by her income and her family's support. She said it all clearly, on the record, under oath. Then Nadine stood up. She submitted my disclosure packet into evidence first. Judge Langford reviewed it in sections. Full ownership of a registered hidden asset accounting practice with 11 retained clients. A debt-free condo purchased in my name during the marriage. And total holdings of $14,800,000, built across 5 years through retained earnings, private equity positions, and municipal bond laddering. None of it had touched a Caldwell dollar. None of it had required Marin's network, her name, or her involvement. Graham moved immediately for marital division of the full asset pool. Nadine let him finish. Then she read the prenup clause into the record. Marin's clause, in Marin's preferred language, and played 42 seconds of audio from a rooftop bar on South Tryon Street, in which Marin's voice explained while laughing that humble men were useful because they signed things. She then placed Marin's sworn testimony side by side with the transfer records and Alma's saved messages, line by line, in a demonstrative exhibit that Graham had no useful response to. Judge Langford took 20 minutes. When she came back, she sanctioned Marin for the pressure campaign against Alma and for the concealed transfers. She awarded me the majority of jointly titled assets. She ordered the lake house sold and the proceeds split per the revised equitable distribution, which, given the sanction, left Marin's share reduced further. Graham's motion for division of my separately held assets was denied in full, based on the prenup clause that Marin had written herself. Marin sat very still while the ruling was read. Rowan was not in the courtroom. Vivian was, and she looked at me once on the way out, a long, assessing look, as if she were finally taking an accurate measurement. I picked up my jacket from the chair and walked out ahead of them both. Was Marin's biggest mistake the affair, the pressure on Alma, or the clause she wrote herself? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. If this story hit, give it a like and subscribe. There's more where this came from.